So welcome to Tara Institute. My name's Damien, and I'm leading this month's Monday nights. So the topic that I've chosen is, I think, a little bit sort of nebulous topic, and that is the importance of looking. So what I hope that we'll do over the next few weeks is discuss this process of looking at my own situation, my own state of mind, the world that I live in, the people I interact with. So we're looking at everything, but maybe in a different context as to what we have normally, the way we normally look at things. So, and I think this is really what the Buddha taught, in the way he sort of taught all these different things. And initially, like when the Buddha became enlightened, he sat for a couple of weeks thinking that nobody would understand what he had experienced or what he had realized. And so then he sort of thought, that he'd come to this enlightenment state, and that it was so different to normal worldly experience that nobody would comprehend it. And so he sat for a couple of weeks thinking, what could he do? And so eventually he realized that his 5 previous friends that he had spent several years in very ascetic meditational practices, that they would possibly be good candidates to understand. So he then went to find them. So, but the point is here that, what the Buddha taught is, let's say, significantly different to our normal worldly approach to life. Our normal, if we had no guidance at all, we would approach life in a certain way, and we would then have all different experiences. We would live a life, we would do whatever we would do, and we would sort of approach it in a certain way. And so I think what Buddhism is giving us is some tools that enable us to look in a very different way at myself, my mind, my feelings, my aspirations, and then even at the physical world, my relationships, my belief in what others should or shouldn't do, all these sort of things, I think all come under the umbrella of looking at things differently. So I am still sort of trying to formulate exactly how I will do this month's topic in trying to communicate that idea, because it's still sort of only partially formed within my own mind. But so the sort of thing I'm talking about is what the Buddha taught first is called the Four Noble Truths. And the first of the Four Noble Truths is the truth of suffering. So we all know that Buddhism is sort of renowned for just wanting to talk about suffering. But the point here is that we may have heard those discussions on, endless description of suffering. But the real point is we have to look and see if it's actually true. So there's no point in outright accepting it, or the Buddha said this, therefore it's true, and there's no point in outright denying it. Well, who wants to believe something that was said, 3,000 years ago? So, either way, we should look and then determine whether we accept or reject. And so to look, we need to have some understanding. We have to have some understanding, and then on the basis of that understanding, we have a tool that enables us to look. So, particularly, I don't know if it was Claire or one of the recent Monday night people, I think, did do the Four Noble Truths. So you may have some sort of recent presentations on that. And so I guess one of the things that I want to look at is, in terms of our experience, we have an external circumstance or an external situation, and I experience that. I experience that situation. You know, whether it's good or bad, I experience that situation. And so I then have maybe an emotional reaction. Maybe I have anger, or I have lust or jealousy or pride, or some, you know, different sorts of experiences in relation to that external circumstance. And so some of the sorts of questions that we can start to examine are, does the external circumstance mandate my response? You know, so we look to see whether the external circumstance mandates my response. And secondly, then we can start to look and we can see whether the, the circumstance that I'm going through is one where I feel very frustrated or very let down or very disappointed or something like that. And so to see whether it's the external circumstance itself which encapsulates completely that experience, you know, like it mandates that experience, or, you know, how much contribution is my reaction or my interpretation, my emotional experience in relation to that? How much does that contribute? So to have this sort of ability, to really look and identify the circumstance which is disturbing me, and to identify my disturbance, which I have generated in response to that, to really look very closely and start to answer some questions. So the sort of questions that we can ask ourselves are, which is the more important factor? The external circumstance itself, or my interpretation, or my emotional reaction, or the embellishment that I might make even on top of that? You know, that some additional embellishment that I might draw in from my own past history, or my own, you know, other mental constructions, you know, maybe like low self-esteem or some other historical factor that then I draw into it, and I make my emotional reaction even stronger. So in this process, you know, we look at the external circumstance, and we look at the process of my contact or my experience with that circumstance. And we can also look at the way my mind is drawn. It's really drawn to that circumstance, and it's really drawn to hold on to and sort of implant that perception very strongly in my consciousness, you know, like to really almost to drown in that experience. And then internally, there's a sort of a process of discussion, like a mental discussion or an embellishment that occurs on top of that experience. And then in relation to that, then I generate frustration or, sense of great loss or disappointment or some emotional response. And then I start to connect that to my whole life history and say, I'm weak, I'm low, I always suffer like this, and we have this sort of, great burden of past experience come in as well. So this sort of experience, shows us that there's a whole lot of different areas that we can examine and understand the process. So I think one of the aspects of looking here is to have the courage to really look at yourself in a very naked and a very honest and a very sincere way. If for instance you have a habit of anger, or you have a great habit of lustful desire or miserliness or whatever, and you can identify that those habituations do cause you to interact with the world in a certain way. And so to have the courage and the honesty to actually see that ingredient within yourself. If pride, like some sort of arrogant pride or some sort of sense of distance to others based on arrogant pride, I think for a lot of us that sort of separation to others can be based on a sense of superiority or indifference, separation, some sort of aloofness. And so to have this sort of real honesty that can have you look and see that situation or that emotion within yourself. And I think this does take a lot of courage, a lot of personal courage to turn the focus internally rather than externally. Because what we are very, very good at doing is that we can say, and I attended a course recently on resilience at work, which was a very kind thing for the company to offer. But in that, they were talking about this process, and I thought, in my mind, it was the wrong approach. But anyway, they had a little chart here, yourself in the middle, and a whole lot of circles around it. And the idea was that into those circles, you would write the initials of the people who drain you and the people who gain you. And I thought, that is so much in contradiction to like the Buddhist teaching. Is we try not to put all the blame on the external, not to blame the external, but to take the responsibility yourself for the response and the emotion or the reaction that you have to that person. So, when you do your little diagram, you put a whole lot of initials. These are all my drainers. These people are draining me. It's sort of like, well, if I could just get rid of those people, I would be happy. And then the gainers, you can put all your little initials in. Don't write their full name, but just their initials will do. You put their initials in the circles, and these are the people who they gain, they give me gain. And it's sort of like, well, if I could just hold on to all those people, I will have everything. So I thought, I have no objection to the idea that I drain my energy and I take energy from others, but to put the responsibility for that onto the other person is missing this ingredient of your own interaction, your own emotional embellishment that we go through. And so this sort of process of looking is, to me, is fundamental, that if I don't really look at my internal processes, my mental thinking, and my own selfishness or self-cherishing, you know, that merely views the world as something that either gives to me or takes from me. You know, like, to me, that is such a sort of self-centric view, that the world, we can look at the world and we can just split it up. This bit gives me, you know, give me happiness, and that bit, stop harming me. You know, like, it's an incredible, very self-centered view of the world. So this idea that I'm trying to cover this month is the idea of really looking, so that if, you know, it's okay to have that view. You know, this is the point. It's okay to have that view right today, because we all have that sort of, we all have these views today. But if we look, we can start the process that tomorrow or the day after, I can soften those views and start to change those views. So I guess that's really the point that I'm trying to make this month, is this process of looking. You know, we have to start to look in a very specific way. So, you know, one way we can think about this is if we imagined some idyllic world, an idyllic world for myself. You know, like wherever I went, whatever I did, you know, whatever shop I went to, whatever interactions I had with people, it would be some sort of idyllic world. So what would that be? You know, in terms of, if we think in terms of other people interacting with me, what would I see as the idyllic behaviour from others? So I think we can all agree that you know, people being kind to me, wherever I went, if people were courteous, kind, respectful, helpful, I don't need people to be adoring and sycophantic and worshipful. Nobody needs that. But just kindness, consideration, respect, assistance. You know, so I think it's worthwhile to consider what are so if we thought an idyllic world would be one where I am surrounded by good people. So the question then is, what is a good person? You know, what is a good person? How do we determine, how do we see what is a good person? Is it somebody who's super smart and arrogant and aggressive and, you know, living in a tower, an ivory tower, looking down on us? You know, is it somebody who's rough and discourteous and thieving or whatever? You know, we can be very clear about this. I don't think it takes much for us to work out what if we thought, what is the idyllic world, my idyllic experience in going down Bay Street and going to a few shops or walking around, what would be the idyllic interaction with others? You know, what sort of people do I imagine in that world? So, you know, I think then it's quite clear that we can think of that situation, and then we can look at ourselves and say, well, how close am I to that idyllic person? You know, and why is it that if I'm so keen that that would make my world idyllic, if other people were like this, why am I so keen to preserve my habitual tendencies of arrogance and roughness and, you know, pride, anger, you know, desire, lustful desire, using, taking? It's an interesting question. You know, we're quite clear about what we think everybody else should be like. If we think, I want to live in an idyllic world, and so other people should be like this, and they should be like this, and they should do this to me, and if I said something, then they should respond like this, and you know, nobody would do this to me, nobody would do that to me. So we're very clear when it comes to others what we imagine that they should be like. So the question then comes, if I'm so clear about that, why am I not like that? You know? And I think that's a really key question. And so here, you know, I guess the point I'm coming to is to look within myself and start to see the habits or the mental processes or the conception that I have of the world and of others, to see how those conceptions are, they're not enabling me to be that type of person. You know, for whatever reason, the processes in my mind and the processes that come through in my actions, that they are not, they're not in sympathy with that sense of what a good person is. And I think that's a key thing to look at and to understand is, you know, if we're all so clear about what a good person is, to then ask ourselves the question, well, if I'm so clear about what a good person is, how come I am so distant to that model? You know, what is it in me that is enabling me to continue to be so distant to that idea of a good person? And so then, you know, to actually answer that question, we have to really look very deeply within ourselves and to start to identify the ingredients that cause me to be different to that image of being a good person. So certainly from a Buddhist point of view, there's two really key fundamental issues that we suffer from, and the first one is this self-cherishing attitude that puts myself really at the centre of the world. And so it's the self-cherishing attitude that sees the world as either giving to me or taking from me. And that, you know, we're sort of trying to get that process happening better all the time. And then the other fundamental error that we make is the way that we actually see the world, the way that we conceive of the world. And that is a process of like very concretely identifying phenomena and people in a very sort of absolute sense. So, you know, whether we can look and see that very easily, that's a big question. And certainly from a Buddhist point of view, it's a long process for us to really clearly identify those two really fundamental causes of our problems. But we can see other layers of our problems fairly readily. The process of the way anger develops, the process of the way lust or desire, strong desire can develop, the process of pride or arrogance, miserliness, these sorts of things. And similarly, the process that love and compassion can develop, the process of how generosity develops, the process of how affection and kind-heartedness develops. So we can also see those sorts of things fairly readily. And part of this is, the actual process for us is to over and over again to see the destructive nature of anger, for instance, to see the really, let's say, the very limiting and small-mindedness of miserliness, and then to see the really warmth and kindness that comes from love and compassion, the expression of concern for others that comes from generosity. So over and over again to see the benefits or the positiveness of what we can call the good qualities, and over again to see the destructiveness and the loss or the smallness of the negative emotions and the negative states of mind, to really sort of become convinced about love and compassion as really beneficial states of mind. So we can have a a very maybe an individual approach. So the reality is that for me, what I'm really concerned about is my happiness and my freedom from suffering. That's really what I'm concerned about, because that's what I experience. What I experience is my happiness and my suffering. So we can start to look at this whole question, and we can see how my happiness and my suffering is affected by my state of mind and the way I process things, the way I interpret things. My happiness and my suffering is affected by that. But then, as humans, we do have a natural altruism, and that altruism may initially be for only a few people, our close family, our children, our parents, our partner, a dear friend, somebody who maybe has helped us a lot, and we have a natural sort of warmth or kindness, altruism towards them, so that we have some feeling of wanting them to be happy and wanting them to be free from suffering. Okay, it may not be as strong as how much I want myself to be happy and I want myself to be free of suffering, but there is something there. So we all naturally, as human beings, we have some of that altruistic thought. Okay? So one of the ingredients here is to recognize that even if that's only for just one person, or it's for 10 people, or 10,000, or 10 billion, or 100 billion, that I have an interaction with others, and that it's to my benefit, it is to my benefit, that others are happy and that others are free from suffering. And also that my interactions with others, you know, it's this particular approach is called the reasoning of dependent arising. This particular approach, and that's to recognise, is to really recognise that my own happiness is dependent on my attitudes and my interactions with others. That, you know, we cannot and do not live in a bubble, so that even though we have the natural inclination that the thing that is most important to me and the thing that I experience, the actual experience in life for me is my happiness and my suffering. But the reality is that my happiness and my suffering is actually dependent on how I interact and the attitudes that I have to others and the behaviour that I have to others. That my own happiness and my own suffering is not an independent sort of phenomena, that it's actually closely dependent on the way that I interact and for instance, you know, we might think that you know, I can look after myself, you know, I know what makes me happy, I know what's suffering, I can keep up the barriers and I can keep away all the suffering. But that mind, the mind that thinks I have to put up the barriers, put up the walls and keep the aliens out of my experience, and everybody's an alien as far as I'm concerned, see, like that sort of mentality, that mere thought is itself destructive of your own happiness. So that the hostile thought that you have in relation to others is itself a destroyer or a diminisher of your own happiness. That's a very important realisation to come to. To see that relationship between your attitude towards others and your own happiness is, you know, that is something very definite. And so these are things to look at, and I think in particular this idea of hostility, to really look and identify the hostility in our mind that we might have to all sorts of different things. You know, maybe to a style of architecture, or a particular way of painting road signs, or graffiti, or shop fronts, or bright lights, you know, 7-Elevens or something. You know, we may have a hostility in our mind towards that appearance. And so to recognise that sense of hostility, and then to understand that presence of the hostility is itself something that diminishes my happiness. And I think that's personally I think that's one of the key things that we all carry really extensively, is a whole bunch of hostile apprehensions of all sorts of different things, whether it's in politics or gardening or the weather or workplace or the newspapers, television, you know, the brand of the coffee beans in the cafe, or whatever it is. We carry all sorts of hostility, and that to look. So this is what I'm talking about, is to look and see that hostility itself is something which diminishes my happiness. So the way that we can then start to make a bit of a dent in that process of, in that very habituated, you know, particularly this hostility aspect, is, you know, through the practice of mindfulness. So here we can see mindfulness. Mindfulness is the ability of your mind to hold on to a chosen apprehension, or a chosen view, or a chosen object. You know, we use the word object, meaning, and that object can mean a person or a thought or a particular apprehension. You know, so we hold on to that object. I'm used to using the word object. And we choose an object, we actually choose an object to focus on, which is virtuous. So a virtuous thing is something which, by its very nature, results in happiness. So if we hold a virtuous object, then my experience is automatically happy, a happy experience, because of the object that I hold. So we'll do a breathing meditation now. So in the breathing meditation, the breath itself is not in itself a virtuous object, but because we are focused 100% on the breath, that focus frees us from any negative experience in that moment. So if we meditate for 2 minutes on the breath, for that 2 minutes, there is no hostility, no grasping, arrogance, attachment, you know, anger, lust will come into the mind, because we're 100% focused on the breath. So that's why when we say focus on the breath, the idea is that you prevent your mind from going to any negative thought. So that process is not easy. So we have to be very focused, keep the focus on the breath, and that 2 minutes will prevent the mind from going to our habitual hostility or resentment or memories, bad memories, anger, you know, all sorts of things that we have bottled up inside of us. So we'll do a little bit of meditation. So just get into a comfortable position. So when we're in the main part of the meditation, you focus just on that, like the awareness. You know, become aware of your breath, just going in and going out, coming in, going. You know, just in a very relaxed manner. But first, become aware. Just become aware of your own mind. What is happening in your mind? And so you bring your focus within yourself. Anything from the past or the future, from outside of here, from outside of your body, you know, just keep bringing your focus or your concentration, your awareness within yourself, and keep bringing it in, letting all of the thoughts, every thought, every distraction, memory, whatever, just fall away. Keep doing that process, sort of like bringing your consciousness down finer and finer until there's like no thought in your mind at all. And then turn your attention to the breath. And hold the breath just absolutely 100%, just on that mere in and out breathing. So let's do that for a few minutes. So just relax your mind a little bit and just check, look. So look and see what happened in your meditation. Don't hide anything from yourself, just be very straight up and identify what happened. Were you daydreaming or sleeping, distracted? So, look and see that and accept it, that that's what happened. And then we will just repeat the same meditation. So we'll do exactly the same again. And we enter this meditation with a very strong determination, a strong determination to have the mental focus completely on the breath, not letting any distraction rise up or interfere, just keeping the focus 100% on the breath. So let's just repeat that same meditation just for a few minutes. And just relax your concentration. So we have some time for some discussion or questions or whatever, if anybody has anything they'd like to offer. Yeah.
So you said before, trying to hold the focus onto a virtuous object in order to generate happiness. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the question is about placing them, holding our mind onto a virtuous object and as a way of generating happiness. So, all right, so some examples of that. Let's say we think that the love is a good thing to have towards somebody else. So you then might say, all right, how do I meditate on love? You don't just think, oh, love, just love, it's not going to work like that. You have to have a reason. So then you can think, well, what are the reasons to have love towards somebody else? So one of the reasons is like a sense of gratitude. You know, in certain circumstances, you know, say towards your mother or something like that, you may have a strong sense of gratitude. You know, if you look at their care for you in a certain way, you can develop a strong sense of gratitude. And so from that basis of this person being somebody to whom I'm very grateful for what they've done, then you can generate a feeling of love towards them. So in that case, the virtuous object you're holding is a person who has been very kind to you. Okay? So let's say it's your mother. So you're holding, so the object is, you can't just say that the object is just your mother. It's, in this case, it's your mother who has been very kind to me. Because you could think, there's my mother, she's been very cruel to me. You know, where you've selectively focused on some different aspect of that person. So here we are selectively focusing on something which engenders that sense of gratitude, and then on the basis of that sense of gratitude we see that they lack happiness. You know, we see that the person lacks happiness, and so we generate love. So love is the wish for somebody to have happiness. The wish for them to have happiness. So we can meditate, let's say, for instance, on your mother, qualified with that gratitude for the kindness, and then seeing that they lack happiness, wishing that they have happiness. And so that process becomes a very sort of powerful and concrete way to generate the feeling that you want this person to have happiness. And that thought is love. So similarly, the thought, you know, you see your mother, you have the sense of gratitude for the kindness that she's shown to you, and then you see that she's suffering, and you generate the wish that she be free of suffering, and so that thought is compassion. So that's a way that you identify a virtuous object. So you could do the same for every living being if you can find some means to view them as having been kind to you, right? So if you can find some way of thinking how they've been kind to you, you can use that argument as a way to generate love and compassion. But you can also generate love and compassion merely on the basis that this person wants happiness and wants to be free of suffering themselves. And so ultimately that in itself is enough reason for you to generate love and compassion towards them. Okay, so that's one example of a virtuous object. Okay. Yeah.
When you were telling us the anecdote about classifying the people with the brain
gain, yeah.
I was immediately thinking of the way I perhaps classify people that are toxic or
yep.
think it's toxic, and at what point can you put up that guard legitimately? Yeah, and that sort of
yeah.
Legitimate.
Yeah.
That where you can just say, no, I've got to shut that out. I've got to shut you out because it's whether I like it or not. It's just, you know. It's
So the observation here is, in terms of that language, identifying people as toxic, or I think what's the opposite? What's the other term that's used in that language? It's
healthy.
Sustaining. Yeah, contributing or something or whatever. Yeah, so, you know, I think this is common in the community, this sort of division. So this identification of somebody being toxic. So there's no question that my interaction with such a person may have a toxic experience for myself. So the big question here, and the one that, you know, in terms of this sort of approach of looking, you know, how much, what percentage is out there and what percentage is in here? Now, the reality is that for us as ordinary people, it can be maybe to some degree beneficial to separate ourselves from the toxic, so-called toxic person or the toxic situation. Like going to Syria and walking down the main street of some town in war is probably a toxic thing to do, toxic situation to put yourself in, but not absolutely, you know. So a person that we identify as so-called toxic, the interaction between that person and myself may be extremely problematic. And so if I can recognise it, if I can separate myself from that circumstance, I will not be drawn into a toxic reaction, let's say. So physical separation can help that issue, but to be really separate from that situation, you have to have mental separation from that thing. So there's no point in walking out of the room but taking them with you in your mind, you know, because you can go anywhere in the world and you're still carrying them in your mind. Okay, so, and I think that gives the indication that the toxicity is not in the person but in your mind. And that's something to look at, is to see where is the toxicity. Is it in the person absolutely? Is it in my mind absolutely? Or is it in a mixture of the two? And we can look at that. We can sort of get some inkling as to what the situation is. But, so, either way, you know, ideally for my happiness and my freedom from suffering, I have to separate. I have to separate from the toxicity. Okay? So we can do that in several ways. One of the simple initial ways that we can do that is that we just forget the object. You know, we forget the object. So that if the mind going to the object is what generates the toxicity experience, then the best thing that I can do is not think about the object. Okay? So then we can then move on to some of the other methods, like that idea of remembering the gratitude or the creating the virtuous object. We can, you know, with courage, we can start to apply that sort of transformation, the transformation of the object from toxic to dear through the power of our own perception. And so that again shows what is really responsible for all of these experiences is actually our own state of mind. The fact that that's possible shows us that the toxicity and the love and compassion are generated from my mind. And again, that's something to look at and examine, whether that's true or not, you know. Yeah.
Some people do behave badly, so I don't know if you react to it. Some people do.
Yeah.
Because of maybe their own issues or stories
You know, so the observation is that some people do behave badly, right? So one of the things the Buddha said is, do not despise a snake for being a snake. So the issue is not what other people do. You know, this is something, I think this is again something to look at. The issue is not what other people do. You know, do not despise fire for having the nature of hot and burning. So, of course, other people are suffering from exactly the same sorts of delusions and harmful thinking and aggression and pride and that I suffer from. So, of course, they will do bad things. You know, others will. The one thing you can be absolutely sure of is that somebody else will operate from their own self-interest and subject to their own delusions and their own distortions and bad thinking and you know, afflictions. That's the one, almost the one thing in life you can guarantee, that I will act out of my own ignorance and my own afflictions and delusions and bad habits. So will everybody else. So there is no shock in there being bad people. You know, like, it's not a shock. So, but what it comes down to is the thing that, and this is the thing to look at, this is the thing to really look at, is how much is my mental attitude responsible for my experience? You know, that is almost the key question of Buddhism. How much am I responsible? How much can I blame on others? You know, how much do I create? How much do others create? That's a key question for us to investigate. But do not despise a snake for having the nature of a snake. Do not despise fire for having the nature to burn. You know, I think if you look and see your own behaviour of negative emotions, you know, arrogance, pride, anger, hatred, you know, grudges, all that, resentment, you know, aggression, hostility, it should be no surprise that somebody else is similar. You know. Yeah. So there's somebody else here? No. Yeah.
So you spoke about generating love for somebody else. So everyone's trying to generate love for someone. Sometimes, or a lot of the time, I'm trying to generate that love for some sort of gain, my intentions not
Yeah.
exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question here is about trying to generate love for somebody else, but seeing that it's actually your own self-interest at work, that you want some particular outcome. That mere recognition of your own self-interest interfering is a really good recognition to have. But also to contemplate that meaning of love that I was talking about before. You know, so not to be confused between love and attachment. So attachment is that self-interest, wanting to possess, hold, to seeing the other person as a real source of happiness for yourself. You know, and then wanting to hold on to, own, possess, grasp, experience. You know, that sort of mental process, thinking this is a real source of happiness for myself. To see that state of mind is different to the state of mind that we were talking about before, about seeing that somebody lacks happiness and then wishing that they have happiness. because that's disconnected to your own self-interest, you know. So to see that one of them is very connected to your own self-interest, and the other one is disconnected to your own self-interest. And so you just think about those two aspects. All right, so thank you very much. So we'll just do a very quick final meditation. So imagine in front of you every living being, and recognizing that everybody has these difficulties. You know, everybody wants happiness and they want to be free from suffering. Everybody, absolutely everybody, is like us, like me, like me. I want happiness, I want to be free from suffering. Every living being is the same. And then thinking that all of us coming together, everybody thinking, meditating, listening, talking, contributing, that is something very special, and that merit, we call that merit, takes the form of a ball of white light in the middle of the room, and then bring it above yourself and let it just pour down into you, like a nectar, pour down into you through the crown of your head, and completely fills your body with light, which then collects at your heart in the form of a big egg made out of light. So at your heart, like a big egg, an egg of light. All this virtue from tonight. And then imagine it radiating out to everybody else, to all this countless living beings in front of you, and bringing them happiness and bringing them freedom from suffering. So imagine the rays of light go out to every living being. Whatever they lack in terms of happiness, that becomes fulfilled. They are filled with happiness. And whatever suffering they have is completely eliminated. Physical and mental suffering, both completely eliminated. And we can imagine that they all experience a great joy. And this dedication, so we're sort of dedicating the virtue from tonight to everybody. So doing this meditation, develop a great sense of delight and joy in being able to do this. So make sure you include everybody else here tonight that are in the room. You can put everybody else here in the front row of all living beings. You know, these are real people in this visualization. And then you can just absorb all that light back into yourself. All right, so thank you very much. There's a cup of tea and a piece of cake or something up there in the dining room. And we'll continue on next week. See where it takes us. Thank you.